This is Walter Carmichael responding to the final three books of the Old Testament, um, Ruth, Esther, and Jonah. This is a video to explain why I believe the books of Ruth, Esther, and Jonah were included in the canon of the Bible. In some sense, they are stories told to answer specific theological questions, either not answered in other books or that needed some further clarifications. With the book of Ruth, we find the issue of conversion to Judaism addressed. There are in the Deuteronomistic text specific prohibitions against marrying Moabite women. Specifically, Deuteronomy 23 verse 3 states that no Ammonite or Moabite shall be admitted to the assembly of the Lord. Even to the 10th generation, none of their descendants shall be admitted to the assembly of the Lord. However, by Ruth clinging to Naomi and saying, "Where you go, I go," she is, in a sense, converting to Judaism. The initial texts of the Jewish people didn't necessarily deal with conversion. When talking about Ammonites and Moabites, they tended to refer to those foreign women who would lead their husbands astray by getting them to worship foreign gods, much like Solomon did. That said, the book of Ruth acknowledges the reality of living among other people and being willing to accept them into the community as long as they worshiped Yahweh faithfully. Ruth plays the part of a faithful Jew better than most historically ethnic Jews were portrayed, and as such is rewarded. A second and likely just as important reason for the inclusion of Ruth is that it establishes where the line of David comes from. It's critical that the Jewish people accept the genealogical lineage of if David had been king, even though he came from a non-Jewish origin. After all, if these were God's chosen people and David were truly non-Jewish, a lineage that passes through the mother, then he couldn't truly have been a king chosen by the God of the Jews. By Ruth's conversion, this story in a sense establishes the legitimacy of David's Jewishness, and so there is never a question of his ethnic upbringing in regards to our understanding of the text. Esther is a story of ethical responsibilities for followers of Yahweh. There's a conspicuous absence of outright divine action in this story. One can certainly argue that God is seen working in the coincidences that continue to occur, but there's an argument to be made that this book is about doing the right thing even when no one is watching. God expects his people to always be faithful and protective of one another, even when he doesn't actively do so. This role falls to Esther and Malachi. Neither of these characters stand out particularly as upright Jews in the story. And by this I mean neither of them is noted to observe dietary restrictions that the Jewish people would be expected to observe, something that in the Persian courts would have caught the attentions of their masters. Malachi identifies himself as a Jew when confronted, but Esther only makes it a point not to do so until the climactic moment in the story that it becomes necessary. This story has several important lessons. It shows how the arrogance of humans can blind people into making poor decisions, like Haman, whose arrogance got him killed, and the very means by which he sought to destroy Malachi. It gives examples of how extreme drunkenness can lead to poor decisions like those made by King Ahasuerus, who allowed himself to be convinced into bad decisions while inebriated, and was forced to hold to them once sober. Finally, it teaches us that God, even when not visibly present, will provide a way out, as he did for Esther and Mordecai. It is the defense of her people and the rallying cry that Esther and Mordecai provide that perhaps once again allows the people to take some pride in their ethnic identity, something they had not necessarily done since the exile, and something this book makes an example of the first ethnic cleansing, so to speak, of the Jewish people. While unlike King Saul in their battles in which they were victorious, the Jews did not plunder and take the spoils of war. In some sense, the similarities and make the difference of them not taking the plunder, even though they were allowed to by Esther and Malachi, even more distinct from Saul. To some extent, perhaps this is somewhat of redemption of Paul. There was some hint in some of the texts that I read that implied that Esther was either related to Saul or was chosen, or her character was chosen as a substitute for King Saul. Jonah is by far the strangest of the stories that we've read, although it may be one of the most familiar to us. We're used to God calling prophets. We're not used to them running away. We're used to God providing redemption, but not necessarily to those who within the next 100 years would help to wipe out the Israelites. Jonah seems to be included to show that God truly is a universal deity that takes care of his entire creation, and that even though perhaps he sought to single out the people of Israel and Judah, the irony, of course, is that unlike the chosen people, the Ninevites actually repented. To be honest, I think Jonah's reaction is entirely human. You expect your enemies to be wiped off the earth by your God, and instead, because they repent, something your own people can't even do, God forgives them. In addition to God showing his mercy to non-Yahwists, God also teaches his own followers a lesson about what happens when they truly do repent. Much like Job, the arrogance of Jonah shines through as he questions God in chapter 4, verses 2 and 3. Jonah said, "O Lord, is this not what I said while I was still in my own country? That is why I fled Tarshish in the beginning. For I knew you were a gracious God and merciful, slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love, and ready to relent from punishing. And now, O Lord, please take my life from me, for it's better for me to die than to live." I find it interesting Jonah is more upset about the death of a tree than the redemption of a people, despite how evil they were supposed to be. They are, after all, humans. But perhaps this is more of a modern way of thinking of people versus an ancient understanding of people outside of one's ethnic subgroup being different or less than or simply non-followers. But that said, these people, and the text makes clear even their animals, the domesticated animals, submitted to the will of Yahweh. It shows, to some extent, the text shows the depth of human anger and animosity and how it can blind us to the beauty of God's salvation. Our sense of vengeance is detrimental and the opposite of God's purpose. God's justice extends out beyond his own chosen people, both to the Ninevites, the Moabites through Ruth, and others which he would eventually use to teach his own people a lesson in devotion. So those are my thoughts on the final three books of the Canon. I look forward to your questions or comments.